Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. On today's episode, I'm super excited because I get to talk to someone I've talked to before. I was a guest on a podcast that he co-hosts. It's definitely my favorite podcast episode that I've been a guest on of the three I've done. And I was a listener beforehand and afterwards. I highly recommend it. We'll plug his podcast later on, but please welcome to the show, Ben. How you doing, Ben?
Hey, I'm doing well, John. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, man, it's really cool. One of the reasons I like your podcast is it's called Threads, and y'all try to live life unfiltered and talk in a very vulnerable fashion, and I think y'all do a very good job of it. But you and your co-host are both Christians, and I was wondering if you could give me maybe like a summary of I don't know, like maybe your first 18 years of your life. You obviously don't have to hit every plot point, but like what was your childhood like, and how did it relate to either Christianity or religion in general?
Yeah. That's something that I'm spending a lot of time in therapy unpacking, is those first 18 years. So, from the surface, or maybe from a 5,000 foot view, it was fairly normal, I guess. Born and raised in a very Dutch, conservative, politically as well as religiously, area in West Michigan. Let's see. Both of my parents were raised in similar settings. So it was kind of this legacy of faith and conservatism that was passed down, and definitely a lot of that pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality and don't make a lot of waves, just put your head down, do the work, and enjoy the evenings and weekends. So that was kind of the family environment that I grew up in. Now, in that environment, there was not a lot of room for, how do I say it? I guess there were just a lot of things that were swept under the rug as a kid. So, for instance, anytime that there was a moment of relational drama or stress in our family, it wasn't necessarily dealt with. It was more or less, just kind of pull out from that troublesome, sticky situation and don't really do anything about it, but just kind of ignore it and let it go away. So that was how I was essentially brought up to deal with stress. That's how I was taught. Just kind of don't make an issue out of it. Just look the other way, sweep it under the rug, and let things go from there. So that's kind of high overview. I can certainly go into a little bit more specifics if you want, but don't want to make this a monologue at the same time.
Well, feel free to monologue. I will say that it sounds very like non-confrontational. I'm wondering if well, first off, were you like a regular attender of church?
Absolutely. Yes. So that was something that I think has just been part of our family's legacy ever since the area that I grew up in was settled. Church was always a very big driving force in life. So as a child, the expectation was you're at church every Sunday, And our church growing up had both a morning service and an evening service and midweek activities. So church was not just a Sunday thing, it was several times a week. And I would say as a child and teenager, a lot of my identity and understanding of who I was shaped and informed by the church. So it was very much a regular part of my life.
So that's actually very similar to how I grew up. I went to church twice on Sunday, and whenever the doors were open otherwise.
Right.
I wonder if how that affected how you perceived like the non-Christian world as a child, and maybe you could compare like growing up how you viewed the non-Christian world versus like maybe when you ventured into adulthood how you started perceiving the
Yeah,
non-Christian world.
that's a great question. So, as a child and teenager, really up until my sophomore year of college, I didn't realize it, but I was incredibly sheltered and just had a very limited understanding of what life was like outside of the church. And, societal problems like homelessness, I would look at people living on the street and just assume they were bums. And that's kind of the term that my friends and I and even our parents, that was just kind of the term that was used. They're bums. They don't want to have jobs. They just want to, take advantage of everybody else, and they're bums. Anybody who lives on the street is a bum. And then um, I would say there was a definitive fear of people outside of the faith. Uh, One development that happened in my neighborhood growing up was um, it was a very rural setting to start. I mean, that's what it was in my early days. But um, this area had a connection to the freeway. And so there was a lot of traffic. And with a lot of traffic comes the potential for growth and urban development and things like that. That was almost seen as like work of the devil. The fact that they're putting a 24-hour 7-Eleven in. My parents, uh, I remember clear to this day, like my parents suggested that I keep a baseball bat under my bed because there's a 24-hour 7-Eleven that's open, and you never know what kind of filth that's going to attract. And um, I don't know for a fact if my dad had a gun close to his bed, but I imagine he did. Um, he was a hunter, still is. So guns were very much a part of his life. So I can only imagine that he had one close by. So there was a definite fear of those outside of the church and those who didn't have faith. And as far as people who had faith, but they weren't part of the Christian faith, it was very much a they're out and we're in, and we Christians are the only right ones, and any other faith is an enemy of the truth, and we need to convert them, and all of this. And then another aspect that was very rarely talked about was mental health. And when it was addressed, like people were referenced as not being right in the head, and that would be a cause for us as Christians to keep our distance and um, or pray it away. I grew up in for the first formative years of my life, they were spent in a charismatic setting, and there were many times that opportunities for prayer were offered. And so mental health issues, the way you deal with those is you cast out the demon of depression or whatever the case may be. So it was such a wild world that I lived in. Um, and it was sheltering. Like I was told to keep my distance from worldly things. So my entire music collection, I still have a bunch of the CDs, was all basically Christian ripoffs of whatever was popular in that time. Uh, I'm really frustrated by that because I feel like I missed out on a lot of good music that I would have really enjoyed as a kid. But being in a Christian family, secular music was frowned upon, just like anything outside of the church was frowned upon. Um, Something else that comes to mind is I was looking for work, and one of my friends at school had said that Burger King was hiring. So I was pretty stoked because I'll work with a friend. That'll be pretty sweet. And so I get home and tell my parents that I want to apply at Burger King, and they're like, no, you're not going to do that. I was like, well, what do you mean? They're like, you're not going to work with those people. And I just said, who are those people? And they couldn't give me a good definitive answer. They just repeated the line again. We don't want you working with those people. We don't want you around those people. And they couldn't provide any further detail about who those people were. It was just kind of this, they're outside of our circle. They're those people. So that was always just a very weird thing. You know, you were either in or you were out. And if you were out, you were feared, um, misunderstood. Um, I have a lot of heartache for the way I grew up. Uh, for some of the people that I know that I treated poorly simply because that's how I was taught and raised to do. So, um, yeah, that's how I would summarize my experience growing up in the church. Um, and there's a running joke on my podcast, the Threads podcast, Life Unfiltered. My co-host Jason will reference some sort of pop culture thing, whether it's a band or a comedian or a movie. And I'll just look at him with a blank stare on my face, like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I missed that one. And again, it just goes back to the fact that I was super sheltered and didn't have a whole lot of exposure to things outside of the church.
Two quick follow-ups. First one's pretty big, so I'll go ahead and just do that one. This is in Western Michigan, correct?
Yes. Yep.
So, not to stereotype any part of the country, do you feel like part of those us versus them language had any like racial implications too?
Absolutely. Um, Growing up, my entire circle was white, with the exception of a couple adopted kids. Um, but again, it wasn't until sophomore year of college, and I can go into more detail on what was so revolutionary about that year. But up until that point, my entire circle, everything I knew of life was white people. And there was a mentality. I don't know if it was ever spoken, but at least in practice and in the way we lived our lives as a family, very rarely did we go out of our way to have any interaction with people who didn't look like us.
Yeah, so that's certainly a type of sheltering that is partially like circumstantial, just like part of the country you live in, part of the unfortunate history of the U.S. Uh, so I'm not gonna throw that all on Christians, but I will wonder if so you're talking about like perceiving you're becoming an adult. There's this event that happens in sophomore college, and maybe this will tie to that event, so if you can tie these two together, go for it. But whatever happened sophomore year, there was a shift at one point because you are technically ordained, correct?
I am. Yep.
So you were interested in ministry at least, right?
Oh gosh, yes. And that's part of my story that I'd gladly unpack more of because I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about now. But I think we can go a little bit deeper a bit later.
Okay, cool. So what was the big event then in college that made you realize, oh my goodness, I lived a very sheltered childhood?
It was the first time that I set foot on an airplane. And so the story goes, I was and again I'll get to more details and unpack this a little bit later, but I'll start by saying that in high school and freshman sophomore year of college, I was very committed to this idea of becoming a professional youth speaker. And it had been prophesied and spoken over my life from a very young age that that was the type of work that I was going to do. And so, because these men who claimed to be filled with the Holy Spirit were prophesying and saying these things about me, I grew up with a very real pressure to fulfill those prophecies. And because of that, I went to a Christian college to pursue um, youth ministry, and I finished that program and stepped through all the hoops and was ordained. But my sophomore year of college, I don't know what it was, but there was just a growing itch inside of me to experience parts of the world that I had not yet experienced. Within the previous year, my freshman year of college, I actually met my wife. We at the time were working in the same youth group. Um, and as I got to know her and learned more about her background and experienced some of the things that she was into, like there was just a very present sense of I guess you could call it FOMO, that fear of missing out. I felt like my experience was so lacking up until that point. So it's the summer between freshman and sophomore year. I think that's the timeline. That's irrelevant. But suffice it to say, I'm just really sensing that I need to get out and experience more of the world because I don't have a clue. So I stumbled upon an organization called the Center for Student Missions. And this is an organization that has chapters all over the country. And basically, college students come in and they can do their internship by leading service or mission trips or whatever you want to call them in these urban cities across America. So I went to the nearest site and had my interview and learned that the Chicago site was already full. They didn't have any need for any more college students to help during that summer. But then they said, but our chapter in Los Angeles, they are still looking for people. Would you be interested? And so this is in 2004. And so I, being the super energetic, I'm going to save the world, super youth speaker, like I even had a domain for myself, bencrocker.com. And if you ever want to see something quite comical, hop on the Wayback Machine. I think that's what it's called. You can use that to go and pull up previous versions of any domain, including bencrocker.com. So I had a website, and my email address tied to that domain name was youthspeaker@bencrocker.com. So I was, again, very full of myself, very committed to this idea of being the fulfillment of what those men had spoken over my life. Ultimately, it brought me to that point, and so did the desire for something different. So it's like those two things collided, and I applied and was accepted to serve in Los Angeles. And that is the summer that broke me. So imagine sheltered Ben, who grew up in this very tight Christian circle, is now in inner city Los Angeles, living in a known gang territory. Our housing unit, several times per night, would have police helicopters flying over it. I would go and sit on the roof at night and just think, where the hell am I? What is this? What have I gotten myself into? And, I had a mentor, a professor who I think I called him daily the first couple of weeks I was out there. It was going from one end of the spectrum to the complete opposite. Like there was no in between. It was just worlds different. So here I am. All I've known up until this point is the sheltered Christian life. And I'm now put in this position where I'm living in inner city Los Angeles. And the first 3 weeks of my time there, the whole idea was for us to get acclimated to the city that we were serving in, so that we could take students on these mission trips and feel comfortable leading them in the city. So the 3 weeks that led up to that, we went to a church service at a Black church, and that was the first time I had ever seen that many Black people together in a church. And during his sermon, the pastor referenced politics, and he said something along the lines of, I vote Democrat. And like my spine just tingled up. I'm like, wait, what? And so on the way home or back to our housing unit, the guy I rode with, who was a fellow host in this program, I said to him, I didn't know that there were Christians who were Democrats. And he was from California, and he kind of just looked at me with a deer in headlights look on his face. And he's like, wait, are you serious? I was like, well, yeah, all my life, Christians have always been Republicans. And he just kind of pauses and hesitates for a minute. I could tell he wants to say something, but he's having trouble finding the words. And finally, he just says it. He says, Ben, I'm a Christian and a Democrat. We exist. And there's a lot of us. And I was just dumbfounded by that. So, and over the course of that summer, experiencing things like Skid Row and seeing the abject poverty that people live in, I could no longer accept the fact that these are just people who are bums and they don't want to work and they don't want to do this or that. My entire idea and understanding of people outside of the church was so off base, and I was broken, so broken during that 3-week span of time. As I'm walking the streets and I'm seeing the homelessness, and then as I'm seeing the mental illness that goes along with it, and as I'm seeing and learning about things like systemic racism and white flight, and how so many churches in the Los Angeles area, as soon as the freeways were built, they relocated to suburban areas and left just holes in the city. And then learning that it's like that in a lot of areas throughout the country. Like that summer just truly crushed me. And I just had to come to terms very quickly with the fact that my life up until that point, there was so much I was missing out on, so much. And it was that summer that really started something in me. Instead of being so focused and wrapped up on fulfilling this crazy prophecy that was spoken over me by these men who claimed to be full of the Spirit, instead of trying to live up to this idea of being a youth speaker and a famous one and like all these things that I thought were important, I realized that it was just a sham. And my life up until that point was so focused on me, which is so contrary to my faith. I mean, Christianity is supposed to be based on Jesus, who, at least according to my understanding, had a love for everybody and served and was the least selfish person I can think of. And yet somehow those who followed him in the church setting that I grew up in tolerated looking the other way. And they tolerated the fact that they really weren't super concerned with social justice issues. They were more concerned with who's in and who's out and seeing the world from a very narrow perspective. So that summer crushed me.
It almost seems like some sort of cognitive dissonance, right? Where it's like, how can we say these kind of things, in church about loving everyone, and then when your earth kind of gets shattered and you look around and you're like, wait a second, it doesn't look like we're doing any of the things we say we're supposed to be doing. Yeah, that's really I'm sure stressful and crisis inducing. I wonder if I'm just kind of curious, do you think that like sheltering was how intentional do you think it was? Do you think it was just like kind of in keeping with tradition, this is the way we do things, or do you think they were like hiding the world from you? Do you wrestle with that question still?
I definitely do. My initial response would be they did exactly what was passed on to them by their parents. And um but there's a lot that I'm unpacking, and there was a lot of mental health issues that were brought up, and there were a lot of relational issues that were brought up by both me and at least one of my siblings, if not both of them. In respect for them, I won't go into a terrible amount of detail, but one of my siblings was at the point of being suicidal, and my parents' way of handling that was taking him to a professional basketball game, as if that would just somehow cure that. So there was certainly a level of my parents did what they knew how to do, and they learned that from their parents and my grandparents' parents. I mean, you could stretch it all the way back to when um, both sides of my family emigrated to America. I think it's just the way they did things, and it was passed down generation after generation. But at the same time, I know for a fact that there were times where I confronted my parents, or at least brought things up to them, and they never adequately explained or answered or gave the level of insight that I was after. And that was a very crushing experience. So I would say it was both. They did their best, but when given opportunities to do it different, they didn't.
Yeah, well, Ben, I do want to say, like, breaking toxic cycles is a very brave move, and I can tell you are ending a line of toxicity just by you being who you are. I so when was the last time you were involved in any kind of ministry?
Well, I am now, but it looks very different from what it did when I first started or when I first wanted to get into ministry. Right now, I love the ministry that I do. I work with we call them life groups at our church. Every church has a different name. It's basically smaller segments of the church body. They meet for purposes of Bible study, relationship building, social justice issues, whatever the case may be. So my ministry now is basically working with the life group leaders, ensuring they have the resources they need to be successful, kind of being a pastor to them, and just, really, it's very difficult to fill somebody else's cup if your cup is just empty. So I see my role as pouring into these leaders so that they can pour into the people in their group. Now, I don't get paid for that. I don't ever want to be paid for it. Quite frankly, I don't think ministry should ever generate an income.
You and I agree on this. Yeah, that specific point. I was actually going to bring that up because you mentioned, I think when I was on your podcast, you said that you don't want your paycheck to ever depend on ministry. Yeah, and that's like an actual conscious statement. That's not just simple burnout. Like that's something you believe is like a moral choice.
It is 100%. Now, if somebody wants to bless me or as a response to me doing something and they want to offer some sort of finance, whatever, I'm not going to turn it down, but I'm not going to go into ministry with the expectation that you're going to pay me with money for this work that I'm doing. It's counterintuitive in my mind. Um, as a Christian, I firmly believe that my allegiance to Christ and his kingdom comes before anything else. So why would I accept payment for something um, that I'm doing as a response to what's been done for me? Like, I don't need to be paid for it. I find greater satisfaction in making a difference in people's life and letting that be enough. Like, I don't need a paycheck. I don't need to be compensated. You know, I think it's a very toxic thing because once money enters the picture, whoever's giving that money feels as if they have the ability to dictate how you go about doing the work that they're paying you for. And that's where things get really messy. And that was certainly the case in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's countless stories of, the rich people in the church controlling the entire church, basically, because they have the biggest pocketbooks. And clearly, that's not an ideal situation for anyone, the faithful or in the faithless. Um, so do you not really have any desire to ever do like full-time ministry? Like I understand the life group is still like life groups are, it's a smaller section of a church, right? So it's this idea of kind of mini communities that are small enough that you can actually get to know each other, right, is the idea. um but I actually, while you were talking, did go on the Wayback Machine and kind of looked at your old website, and yeah, definitely entertaining to look through. But I'm wondering if, like, you still have any desire to, like, kind of like, I don't know, even if it's just a daydream every now and then, do something like bigger in ministry at all?
No, I don't think so. Um, I'm pretty content with where I'm at now as far as what I do for work. I work in sales and I work for an IT company right now. And I love that having that job affords me the ability to do things outside of work, like being the life group leader. So after my very toxic experience serving full time and depending on that paycheck from the church, I can't ever go back. It's not even something that I desire or want. Um, I think a lot of church in America is done very poorly, and one of the things that stands out to me the most, one of the biggest failings that I see with the church in America, is the fact that there's experts somehow, and that there's these mega church pastors, and it's like the select few pastors do the bulk of the work. And my understanding, based on how I'm reading and interpreting scripture, is that's not a not that's not at all what Jesus had in mind when he established the church. Like, he took common folk, the disciples, and told them to go and make more disciples. And it wasn't like this we're better than you crowd of, the elite pastors. No, it was the common folk. And that was the most amazing thing about the early church is, Jesus took and invited these normal men and really changed the world. Whether you're a believer in Christ and Christianity or not, the fact that he still talked about 2,000 years after he walked the earth. I mean, think what you want to think about Jesus, but the fact that he's still a present figure is pretty revolutionary. And he didn't accomplish that with a megachurch. He didn't accomplish that with, titles and prosperity and everything else that the American church is getting wrong. He did it with common folk. And so that's what attracts me to the church, is the fact that an IT salesman can be in this role of encouraging life group leaders and developing community and rallying around a cause and seeing growth happen. Like, that sounds a hell of a lot more attractive to me than being in a very isolating position as a church staff member and being put on that pedestal. Like, it's just awful. I couldn't ever go back.
Yeah, I think you and I feel pretty similar on a lot of what you just said, including the fact that I'm actually, I'm pretty loud and proud against evangelicalism, but I am not particularly anti-Jesus. And I think that's actually a pretty easy distinction to make because, as you were saying, Jesus's style of ministry looks very different than the American church. If maybe 5 minutes or less if you can. It's a big question, but go any way you want with it. What does being a Christian mean to you now?
First of all, I struggle with the word Christian, to be honest, because there's so much that's wrapped up in that. So I think the best way that I can explain what a Christian is to me is to explain what it's not. In our world, especially here in our American context, the word Christian has become synonymous with nationalism, with Republican ideologies, with conservatism, and all these different things. Like, you think Christian, and in America, stereotypically, the thought that comes to mind is somebody who's white and somebody who is probably a Trump supporter. They're probably very conservative leaning. They're known more about the things they're known for, the things they're against, whether that's abortion or anything else. And generally they're seen as obnoxious and not really something that people want to be affiliated with. So to me, that's what I think of when I hear the word Christian. And that's why I don't like that term. But to answer your question, I think a better word would be a follower of Jesus. And what does that look like for me? Pretty simple. Looking at the example of Jesus based on the historical texts and other data that we have, and seeking to embody those things. It's being a citizen, not just of America, but being a citizen of heaven. And this new church that my family joined within the last year has just been so revolutionary for me. I think it was one of the first Sundays we attended. Like, the pastor essentially was, I think it was close to either Independence Day or Memorial Day. I can't remember specifically which day. But the pastor was really making a case for the fact that so much of the church and Christianity is so closely tied to politics and so wrapped up in earthly concerns. And he contrasted that with this radical idea that if we are going to identify as Christ followers, then that changes our allegiance, and we don't see ourselves as citizens of America, but rather we see ourselves as citizens of heaven, and we're here on earth as ambassadors, doing the business of heaven, doing the business of what Christ called us to. And that comes first and foremost as primary, and any political affiliation or anything else falls secondary to that. And so lived out, that looks like doing the things Jesus called us to, loving one another, feeding the sick, giving clothes to those who are naked, being peacemakers, turning the other cheek, putting others before ourselves, laying our lives down. So, in short, that's what being a Christian means to me. What it looks like to me. It's saddening and very discouraging how something so beautiful as that has been twisted and turned into the common understanding of the word Christian in America today.
Well, it's kind of funny because the early Christians did not call themselves Christians. They were called Christians as an insult. Like, it was like, oh, you little Christ, by their detractors. And it's kind of funny because that's like how a lot of Christians now, who are more of the progressive variety, or at least the ones who care about social justice, the ones who seem to want to actually follow Jesus's example a little more directly, they seem to see Christian as an insult, kind of like you do. The original idea of Christianity was following the way. Maybe you've seen a church called the Way. Like, that's where that comes from. That's cool. I don't really have much beef with that, right? I will say, like, it's a little bit more than following the example when you start getting into citizenship of heaven, because that sounds kind of like, well, that I would assume that means that's predicated on the belief that Jesus was God, and not like a mere man, and some, like, basic Orthodox Christian things, I guess you would say. So you're Orthodox Christian, but maybe not evangelical. Like, is that maybe a fine hair to split?
It is, definitely. I'm comfortable with Orthodox. I feel like the evangelical movement has made this idea of becoming a Christian, it's twisted it into the idea that it's something that it's like a switch that you just turn on. Like, you can just pray this magical prayer and all of a sudden your sins are forgiven and you're going to heaven. But the way I see it, being a Christian is definitely predicated on belief. Like, that's like the foundation. I saw a meme or a TikTok, I don't even remember who it was, but the basic idea was Christianity is not just about like praying the right prayers, saying the right things, saying no to the wrong things. No, Christianity should be seen as the orientation of your heart. Are you orienting yourself towards the cross? Are you orienting yourself towards orthodoxy, I guess? But I'm doing a terrible job of summarizing this video that I saw, but perhaps I can pull it up and send it to you. But it was just I wanted to just stand up and shout, yes, that's what it is. It's so much less about this emotional, at the end of the church service, altar call where people are emotionally manipulated to go and, quote, give their lives to Jesus and be forgiven of their sins. Like, it's less of that and more of orienting our hearts, pointing the things. It's changing the things that are valuable to us, right? Like, it's letting go of selfishness. It's letting go of putting myself at the center of life and instead orienting my life on Jesus and following in his footsteps and doing the things he instructed me to do. And not only is it me that's orienting my heart towards Jesus and towards the cross and to the risen Christ and the hope that's found there, but I'm doing that in the company of people in my life groups, people at church. I'm doing that in the company of Jason, who I host my podcast with. I'm doing that in the company of my family. And it's like, we're all choosing to orient and point ourselves to Jesus. And it's like the true north. You know, we're choosing to follow in that direction. And that's what I think Christianity is supposed to be. And that was the original intent. But somewhere along the line, things just got very convoluted. And that very simple idea of just orienting one's life in that direction, there were so many hoops that were added onto it. There were so many um, baggage and just so much that was put in that path. In my mind, it's a very simple path, and it's a path you choose to walk daily. But I think Christians have really made it far more complicated than it needs to be.
Well, Christianity as kind of like a Romans 12 lifestyle, right, is kind of what you're describing as a more so like, yeah, following in the example of Jesus and being actually concerned with the real tangible life in front of you more than just like different theological uh, pontifications by the hierarchies of established churches. So you and I have both came from maybe, you know, somewhat sheltered backgrounds and grew up in this kind of odd Christian world just based on you know, the era and the era of white evangelicalism in the US. And that's bound to create some trust issues that you know are going to have to you know, you and I seek therapy for. um I'm wondering, trust issues, everybody's got them, right? Like, trust in itself is always a risk. You know, nothing is guaranteed in our relationships or our life stories, even. You know, new information, more wisdom, and circumstantial situations affect our worldviews and our actions. You know, the more data we gather as we live, we behave differently accordingly, right? Um, and this might be what makes trusting what we can see difficult. And perhaps it's what makes it even harder to trust the unseen. You know, more conceptual type thinking. So do you personally like have trouble in general trusting like the knowable, tangible relationships or physical things in front of you, or the unknowable? Do you have more issues trusting things that you can't see?
That's a really good question. I guess my knee-jerk reaction to that would be, and it's not entirely to your point, but we'll get there eventually, I think. I have a harder time trusting, quote, Christians than people who don't have any faith. Like, it's easier for me to take somebody at their word if their faith is not like front and center. It's almost as if, because of my experience growing up and because of being sheltered, it's difficult for me. I definitely have a chip on my shoulder when I see people who hold the title of Christian so strongly. It's harder for me to trust them than it would be somebody who doesn't have faith at all. Um, does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. I think it's interesting you say that because, you know, trust is hard to earn but easy to break, right? Like, it can
Yes.
take years to build trust with someone and literally seconds to break that trust. Um, and restoring your own trustworthiness after you fail is like incredibly challenging. You know, even to trust yourself or to get other people to trust you, and figuring out, you know, in your relationships, what to forgive, what to forget, what to throw, you know, what relationships to just throw away. That's an excruciating process in life. It's probably one of the hardest things we have to deal with as humans. Um, I don't know. Do you find yourself having to like build trust with people or break trust with people like more often in your life?
Again, for the dichotomy between those of faith and those not of faith is very present there as I think about that question as well. Um, you know, there was a season in my life, and I think I'm slowly exiting that season. But I would say after that summer in Los Angeles, that really broke me and reshaped me, there were a lot of people that I had to distance myself from, and maybe even break trust with, because this new way of living that I found myself in, this new way of thinking and seeing the world, was far more valuable to me than trying to maintain a level of trust or relationship with people who were not open to seeing things differently than what they had grown up with or what they had grown accustomed to. So there was certainly a period in my life, um, and it's becoming less and less now, but where I really had a very difficult time trusting people. Um, and a lot of that was due to the pain that I experienced at the hands of the church. So, um,
That's interesting you say that, because like communities do rise and fall on this idea of trust. Like there are countless examples of communities collectively, grieving disturbing or disappointing news from, their leaders or any figure. I mean, when figures are given authority and they fail, the community can fall or the community can rise in support of that figure, right? And this happens with celebrities, politicians, and pastors, and just like your general friend groups and like smaller little institutions. Like this idea of a group, um, rising to the task of trusting or not being able to trust someone anymore. I'm sure you have, if you've been in church as many churches as I have. And it doesn't have to be church; it could be a different community. But have you ever felt like betrayed by a leader of a community?
oh, 100%. It honestly is a lot of the reason why I left that world of, you know, I guess really I left the very thing I went to school for and had centered my life around, was being in full-time ministry. I left that because of an experience at a church that was so horrible. And there were significant um, trust issues that transpired during that time. Um, that's a loaded question. So the senior pastor that I was working under, and I don't want to. I'm going to make a very valiant effort to not talk negatively about this individual, because he and I have we've chosen to forgive and move on, and that was something that happened, I would say, about 3 years ago. This church is in Oregon, and that's where I, again, wanting something new and different for my wife and I accepted a position as a youth pastor out at a church in Oregon. That church was amazing, great experience, but it was a small rural church, and they ran out of money and couldn't afford me. Um, and then I ended up at this second church where all hell broke loose in so many different ways. And since that experience, I just want to say it from the beginning, I've talked things out with the pastor, and I at least have an understanding of where he was on an emotional and mental health level and where I was. And it's no surprise that we clashed so badly. So I will share my story, but I want to say from the outset that I don't hold any ill will towards this individual. I share this story because I think there's a lot that can be learned from it, and it's helpful for the context of understanding my story. But in this church, I found myself in a situation where there were so many unwritten expectations to how I should be going about my job. And there were several influential families who donated lots to the church budget and felt as if they had the power to sway or determine how the youth pastor does his job. And I have always been, okay, maybe not always, but since Los Angeles, I've been very committed to being outside of the box. And that was welcomed and celebrated in the first church that I served at. In fact, to this day, 14, 15 years later, I'm still in touch with a number of students who are now adults and having families of their own. And gosh, the experiences we had were so phenomenal, and they reach out to me on a regular basis, and I'm still a part of their life. That was a situation where things went very well because I was trusted to do my job and to do the work that I was called to do, and to do it in a way that I felt was the right way for me and for the youth I was leading. In the second church that I served in, I didn't have that autonomy. I was essentially handed a list of things, but that list wasn't written. It was almost as if it was written over time, or it was unwritten and I just stumbled on it by accident. And so the pastor and these families all had these very different ideas of what youth ministry should look like in their church context. And I was not willing to budge. I really was convinced, and to this day, to a certain degree, I really believe in the work that I was trying to accomplish in that church. But there were those who just vehemently disagreed and saw my ministry and my time there as highly ineffective because their kids didn't like going to youth group. And so the select few were given a voice that was very strong. And because the pastor's kids were part of that, it was like they had zero trust in me at that point. I had broken their trust because I chose to stick to my guns and do the youth group the way I felt I was being called and directed to do it. And so that, very quickly came to a head with the senior pastor. And in a 2-year span of time, the first year was okay. I think we were just getting to know each other. But the second year was horrible. I felt second guessed. I felt as if every part of my life was under the microscope because their kids didn't like youth group. And it's just so funny to even say it that way, but that's very much what the experience was. There were other kids who were a part of the youth group that came from other churches or didn't have a church, and they came with friends, and so many great things were happening. And it was like nobody in the church that had an opinion that mattered saw that. They only chose to see what they wanted to see, and that was Ben's not doing his job the way we want him to. So that all kind of came to a head, and this is the biggest trust issue that I experienced. We were in a meeting with the pastor and a couple of board members, and things had come to a head. It was ugly, but at least things were on the table. Expectations, everything else. It's all on the table. We're all looking at the ugliness and talking about it. And one of the board members says to the pastor, "Are you willing to work this out with Ben? Now that we've got this all out on the table, can we structure a way forward?" And with a great deal of thought and awkward pause, he responded that yes, I'm willing to reconcile differences and find a way to make this work. I'm committed to Ben. And in that moment, it's probably foolish now knowing what I, know, after that experience, it was silly of me to do this, but in that meeting, I let out a sigh of relief. It was like, oh, okay, pressure's off. He's going to give this a second chance. He's going to work this out. We're going to find a way to move forward. So I was just breathing a collective sigh of relief. The very next day, there was a board meeting, and I knew this board meeting was happening, and I knew that I was going to be asked to leave and not be present for this board meeting because they were going to talk about all of the things that had led up to that conversation the day before. Now, I was under the impression that the pastor had my back and that he was going to say to the board members, the rest of the board that Ben and I are committed to making this work, just like he had told me the day before. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't happen. In fact, what happened was one of the most toxic things that I can think of that I've seen in a church happen, as far as a leadership level. The board members, the commoners, as I was talking about from the Bible, those who, like the early disciples, these guys, they were all guys. That's another story for another time. I think there should have been some female representation in there, but I digress. So these guys who had been tasked with being leaders in the church on a volunteer basis, they worked their own day jobs. Instead of, really living into that role, they just shrugged off any sort of responsibility and told the senior pastor, "We will support you in whatever you want to do." So there was no, like, let's talk about this. Let's continue the conversation you had with Ben yesterday. And then somehow, some way, I'll never understand why or how, but the senior pastor said, "Well, okay, in that case, I'd want Ben gone." I'm summarizing. That's probably not how it was said, but that was the final outcome. So I get a phone call that night at 10 o'clock. "You need to come to the church." And I was like, oh, I knew exactly why I was going to the church. Why else would I go to the church at 10 o'clock at night? So I go and walk in, and the chairman of the board is standing in the entryway. He's anxious as what, and pacing, and he's like, "Hey, Ben, I need you to come into the pastor's office." Whew. And so I did, and I sat down, and the pastor remained silent pretty much this whole time. And the chairman of the board basically looks over at me and says, "Ben, we've decided that we're going to ask for your resignation," which in the Christian church world is code for "you're fired." And in that moment, ooh, talk about broken trust. I was furious, livid, probably as angry as I've ever felt. And I just stood up. I wanted to hit somebody or hit something, but I didn't. Instead, I just stood up and just angrily said, "Well, there's nothing more to be said, so I'm leaving." So I just stormed out, and that was that. I didn't stay for any dialogue. I didn't want to. I mean, I'm in a room with somebody who, in the very same room that 24 hours ago told me he was committed to restoration, can't even talk to me in this moment. And instead, the chairman of the board does the dirty work of telling me that I'm fired. So yeah, I've been I've been hurt by the church. I've been there's I think that's the principal reason why it's so difficult for me to trust Christians is that moment. It was devastating.
You were lied to, and not only were you lied to, I mean, not to play therapist, but like connecting some dots. You're telling me your story. You grow up in a non-confrontational home, you try to break away from that and change the cycle, and then here you are dealing with a pastor who's not confrontational enough to say what he's actually thinking.
Right. Precisely.
And so, like, how could you not, like, like, feel like, 2 feet tall, and like you don't matter. And frankly, it's really common. You brought up like the pastor's kids being like some of the driving force, and all that politicking, man, it just gets really, really stressful. I worked in several different churches, and honestly I don't think I had one single healthy dynamic with me and a pastor. Even the ones I liked and got along with, it was just like, at the end of the day, no matter how many like policies were in place, no matter how they structured their accountability, however they wanted to frame it, at the end of the day, what the pastor said went. And
Oh, Without a doubt.
And it's just it's ridiculous, and totally anger inducing, and I think that's a completely valid feeling. Kudos to you for being able to bury the hatchet with someone. I'm the type of person who, once I'm bitter, and I'll drink that poison all day long, and I have no desire to have any I don't know, restoration with people who have burned me that bad. But I will say, it's interesting we're talking about this trust, these trust issues, and it's funny because the word, trust and the word faith, like, are somewhat related. I don't know if you had any like philosophy classes in school or anything, but one of the classic philosophy quandaries is faith and reason, right? Like, faith is either beyond or contained in reason. Which comes first, and the question goes, do we make our faith reasonable, or do we decide our faith based on like reasonable deductions? So like, are we like believing something and then finding reasons for it, or are we seeing a bunch of reasons to believe something and believing it? And there might not be a right answer, right? It might just be one of those questions that's kind of stupid and just makes you think in circles. But my typical predisposition is just to believe, that people typically just believe whatever they want, regardless of what reasons they're presented. But that's pretty cynical of me to think that way. Do you have any like opinions on this topic?
I think I'm with you in a lot of ways. For example, so context. My wife and I are adoptive parents, and one of our kids is Black. And we live in a country where the racial landscape is just appalling. Between the amount of systemic racism that exists, and yet so many people want to just, Christians included, people who just want to pretend it's not there. I have major trust issues with, like, even the justice system comes to mind. Earlier this week, Derek Chauvin was convicted on all 3 counts against him in the murder of George Floyd. And here's what saddens me about that. The entire evidence, everything you needed for a conviction was there. But I'm angered by the fact that I couldn't put trust in our court system to do the right thing. Like, it's appalling to me that there was this collective sense of just anxiety and question and doubt and genuine fear that the right thing would not come to be. Like, the fact that it was even up for discussion just blows me away. So you have evidence, it's documented on video from multiple perspectives. You've got the coroner's report and all these things. It's like, you've got the hard data. How could you not arrive at the conclusion that Derek Chauvin is guilty? So that comes to mind as something that you would think that if people are given that kind of evidence and everything else, I would hope they would make the right decision, but they don't. People are stupid, myself included at times. Even given, copious amounts of information, people still are impulsive, and they act on impulse. They act on emotion, and those things cloud the very things that should be trusted. So I too have a very difficult time trusting people, even when they've been provided with everything they need to come to a certain conclusion.
Yeah, the term's almost like willful ignorance, right? Like, it's like you have the data and you're just purposely ignoring it. And yeah, I mean, that example, yeah, there's still people even after the court case, like, trying to defend a dude who murdered another dude in front of all of us. Like, we saw it, and it's there's nothing to argue. They're like, oh, he might have had fentanyl in his system. It's like, who cares? Like, frankly, who cares? He didn't, but like, frankly, like, who cares? And it's one of those things where it just kind of yeah, that's kind of a cynical way to look at it. You could also say that people are misinformed, right? Like maybe they are being reasonable and they just have the wrong information. Maybe their Facebook algorithm just sucks. You know, and so like I think that's where the tension in that question is. And I think it's funny because if we try to like, I don't know, splice these terms, trust versus faith a little more, like, trust can be based on reason or faith, I guess, or some sort of weird combination, because you can find someone trustworthy, then actively choose to believe that they will be, good for you or tell you the truth. Or you can trust someone regardless of the evidence put forth. Sometimes that's a mistake, but I don't know, when you trust people, do you feel like it's a more reasonable and thought out choice to trust people, or do you kind of trust your gut more?
I think my first instinct is to go with my gut, because very rarely has my gut been off. But in order to have a gut feeling that's correct, I need to be informed. So I feel like it's both. But I think the actual in the moment decision, I don't think back to, oh, I read this on that date and processed this piece of information, and that's what influencing me to make this choice. It's more of, okay, in this moment, based on how I'm feeling, how I'm showing up and arriving in the situation, I'm either choosing to trust this person or I'm not. It's not like a mental game I go through. It's very much gut level, but it's an informed gut level, because part of how I approach the world and interact with the world is I'm eternally curious, and I'm going to do my homework, and I'm going to be informed, and I'm going to look at various sources of information so that it's not just one side influencing me. So I would say in general, I do as much as I can to be informed, and then in the moment I react on a gut basis, but that gut is informed by the research and everything else that I've done leading up to that.
That makes sense. I think I might operate somewhat similar. I certainly am more likely to I don't know, just I don't I have a bad habit of maybe putting too, I wouldn't even say too much trust in people, but maybe the wrong kind of trust in the wrong kinds of people. Maybe trusting certain people with information that should be reserved for, closer friends or people who have already proven their trustworthiness, and not assume that, every new friendship I form is going to be healthy if I establish some form of trust.
Sure.
One thing that has been brought to my attention, I'm a divorced guy, and I'll go out on like a little date here and there, and multiple people have brought up to me, they're like, you don't have to mention you're divorced on the first date. And that's weird, because I'm like, well, but like then I'm lying, aren't I? And they're like, no. They're like, I mean, if it comes up, it comes up, but like, is that how you see yourself? Is that your identity, that you're just a divorced person and you always will be? And I'm like, well, no. And they're like, so you don't have to bring it up. And that's one of those weird things that you just kind of have to balance your own vulnerability with establishing a relationship.
Oh yeah. Look, you could buy my book, you wanna buy my book, go buy my book, go to VernerBooks.com, yeah, go to VernerBooks.com, yeah, go buy my book and buy my book. If you go to VernerBooks.com, you can buy my book, you can buy my book, yeah. The Cult of Christianity, exclusively available on Amazon. You can search The Cult of Christianity, How Churches Control, Contain, and Convert by John Verner, or you can go to VernerBooks.com. You can go to VernerBooks.com. Go to VernerBooks.com. Buy my book! Buy my book! Buy my book.
Trust can be naive. We know that. Because sometimes people put trust in ideas, communities, or figures that they should not. One recent president comes to mind. And everyone does this. Like, there is no shame in it. It's something we as humans do. We trust people we shouldn't. However, repeatedly trusting in something you shouldn't is definitely unhealthy, and
Yes.
potentially causes harm to more than just yourself. Do you agree with me that that's pretty common?
Absolutely. And I'm again thinking of this in my context of my experience. So I mentioned a little bit about the pastors and evangelists and whatever else that at this charismatic church spoke things over me. I trusted them, and I sought to live my life in accordance with their words about what my future was going to be like. And I trusted them I was a child, so I couldn't really process through it. And, you know, a big part of me wonders why my parents took them at their word. Why didn't they question? And again, something I'm unpacking in therapy, but, there was this level of trust that I put in those people. And as I got into high school, my pursuits of being this youth speaker were being noticed in the wider context of the faith community outside of my church. And there was a nonprofit organization who got wind of Ben and what he was doing, and they wanted to stand behind me and support me. And so the woman who was at the helm of this organization, I, without question or without thinking it through, I just immediately put my trust in her as somebody who has my best interests. And, you know, there was a lot that my gut was telling me even back then, that this isn't right. Like, slow down. Like, this is not somebody you should be freely giving your trust to. But I did. And that woman has caused significant amount of turmoil emotionally to me. I would say that she was spiritually abusive and couldn't tolerate certain ways of thinking and would try to do everything in her power to change my view of things. And what's really interesting is, fast forward to after that shitty experience at the second church in Oregon, ultimately 9 months later, my family ended up moving back to Michigan. And there's a Bible verse that says something like, just as a dog returns to its vomit, I very much feel that's what happened here. I again put my trust in this woman who before I never had good gut feelings about, and I could tell that some of what she was doing was pretty off base and questionable. But she just happened to have an open position at her nonprofit. And like a dog returns to its vomit, I just went right back there. And that experience was debilitating as well. She made me think things about myself that were so untrue. Like, she would bring up like constantly how proud and boastful I was. And I'm like, looking back at that, I was like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, I know I don't know you super well, Ben, but like, boastful is not the first word that comes to mind.
Right. But she put her claws in deep, and I was in a very vulnerable, broken spot after leaving that last church. And it's almost as if she heard of me coming and was like a vulture or something going after roadkill. Like, she put her claws in so deep and took advantage of where I was at mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And it was disastrous. And, it was my wife who pointed out to me, babe, this isn't right. That's not who you are. You can't look me in the eye and tell me that those things she's saying about you are true. And she was right. And to this day, I'm, there's a lot of toxicity and a lot of, I put trust in people that I should never have entrusted so much to. And I'm dealing with the fallout from that. And it's very painful and at the same time, life-giving process of, taking those claws out and seeking healing for the wounds that that they caused.
Wow. I mean, there's a lot there. Gosh, I want to address so much. I'll try to keep it simple though. I will say, firstly, that it's interesting you bring up this like idea of it's almost like she didn't want you to trust yourself, right?
Yeah, it's precisely it, because the human flesh is not to be trusted. Like that again, that's just the mentality she operated with.
Yeah, and I feel like that is like the epitome of like an evangelical trait is they don't want you to trust yourself. They want you to doubt your instincts. And like
Yes.
they'll use biblical language, but in my opinion, they want to provide you with their program, and your instincts might lead you away from their program. And that it's about control. And frankly, you were talking about I don't know, like talking about gut feelings, and I can't help but say for my life, and this certainly does not have to apply to anyone else, but for my life, that gut feeling of not trust has been there with me in every time I went to church. Like even as a kid, growing up, having very different worldviews the whole time. But even as my worldviews changed, I studied to be a pastor. I was in leadership. I did a bunch of different stuff, and I still just did not trust Christians. You mentioned that earlier too. And again, I think the ball might be in their court. They might be the ones instigating this whole trust issue because they don't want you to even trust your own thoughts. And what can you do if you can't even trust your own thoughts?
Exactly. The whole Christian perspective, the evangelical perspective that I was raised is I'm filthy through and through, and I need the blood of Jesus to cover me because what I am is not enough. There is a lack. And anytime I rely on me or my strengths or my intuition or emotion or my viewpoint, anytime I lean into those things, the evangelical answer is don't do that. You can't trust yourself. You're awful. You're putrid. And so much shame enters the picture from evangelical Christianity because it's drilled into you that you are so unholy that this dude Jesus had to go and basically commit suicide on a cross, and it's because of his sacrifice that you can ever be right again. And it's just so wrong. Like that's basically saying that what God created, if you're going to hold to this viewpoint that you're created in God's image, what does that say about God, that you can't trust the things that he created you with? You can't lean on your own understanding. You can't it's like it's so messed up. And that is just something that I'll never fully understand or comprehend is that idea that we are just through and through bad as humans. I just think it's so far off base, and yet that's the kind of hook that the evangelical church uses to get people to join them, to join their weird worldview, and it's so damaging.
Yeah, and it's descended from, Protestantism, which like got its influence from Calvinism. The idea we're talking about is total depravity, right? Like that's the theological term. And it's funny because if you actually read Calvin, he's a lot less harsh than his followers continued on. But I digress. It's funny that evangelicals don't only, they instill this like self-doubt, and then they also are very clear that they don't want you to trust anti-evangelicals. So, for example, evangelicals typically don't like me. And it makes sense to find some disdain for a group or a person or an idea that opposes your worldviews. But I find it odd that they avoid honest conversations with the other side. That's the part that's tricky for me, because if your truth is God's truth, why can't you listen to the other side?
Exactly. Oh my goodness, yes. That is precisely our entire mission as a podcast, the one that I host, Threads Podcast, Life Unfiltered, shameless plug. But that's our whole, like, that's what we love doing, is giving a voice to people who may not agree with us, and being okay with that, and not feeling a pressure in those conversations to push them to see the world the way we see the world. Like, for example, having you on our show, I was admittedly a little bit nervous about it because I didn't want it to become a bash session on the church, but it wasn't. You were very respectful of us and of our faith, and we were very respectful of you and your experiences and your viewpoint. And we, not to boast, but we really just wanted to hear your story. And that's what's missing from church and from Christianity, is there's an unwillingness to just sit and listen. It's like they always have to be talking, they always have to be pontificating, and if they do listen, they're listening with one ear, but the rest of their brain is so focused on coming up with a reply or a retort as to why that perspective is wrong. And it's like you can't really genuinely be an evangelical and actually listen, because you're so focused on why you're right and why the other person is wrong.
Man, it's so awesome that you brought up that point, because I don't know if you've listened to any of my previous episodes or anything, but I actually talked about this in the first one, because that was one of the moments that kind of like was a plot point in my story, where I was like, I'm going to take a 180 and turn away from Christianity, was when I realized I'm programmed, was when I realized someone was talking to me about a very tragic thing, and I was getting my replies ready. And I was like, wait a second, that's not me. That's just like what I think I'm supposed to say next. I'm like, that didn't come from me. That's not what I actually think. Like, what is happening here? And that's kind of when I was like, this, like that. I think that might have been the first moment where the word cult like kind of flashed across my brain. And I was like, oh my gosh. And, you know, again, yes, it was an absolute pleasure being on your podcast, I will say. And yeah, I you know, you've probably gotten the sense I'm not too big on church bashing, although I mean maybe in private, you know, with just joking around. But no, I don't really mind people being Christians. I will say I tend to get along better with Christians who don't go to church. The Christians who do, I'm still a little wary of, maybe my own trust issues, but you know, and even when the terms are different, like, I'm not gonna lie, like even earlier when you said life group, like I kind of cringed inside a little bit, you know.
Oh, so do I.
Yeah. Just because it's one of those things where you're like, well, you know, I mean, it totally could be on the up and up. Like, it totally could. I don't have any evidence to say it's not, you know, but it's one of those things where you just, you know, you have your own experiences, and certain things, you know, trigger different thoughts. I think it's fascinating with, you know, white evangelicalism. They do this thing where they're like, okay, no, don't trust yourself, you know, don't trust anything that, you know, someone who wrote a book that says the cult of Christianity says. But then it's also like, but don't, the craziest element is probably they don't want you to trust your own spiritual inclination. Like, the oddest part of the cult of Christianity is that they are reluctant to listen to the layman's spiritual language. If anything that is not mainstream or orthodox is propagated, like, great caution and judgment is applied by the leaders. And so this evangelical cult, to use my word, teaches that God communicates through their hierarchy. And if you venture on your own, you'll be a lost sheep. And I honestly, like, this is where it's such a hard line for me, where it's like, okay, this is the difference between a faith difference and y'all being a toxic cult, right? Because you and I, in talking, I can tell we could get a beer anytime. We would be fine. We would maybe butt heads if we got really into the weeds on something. But, like, in general, we're not going to butt heads because you have your worldview, I have mine, and we're fine with it. And it's not hurting each other. We're not, you're out to do good in the world, I'm out to do good in the world. We respect each other on that basic level. And we can do that. But when you have these churches that create these hierarchies that essentially claim to be the voice of God. That's just a hard line for me. That's a cult instead of just a regular religion.
Right. And again, I keep bringing up the very formative toxic experience of my childhood. Growing up in that charismatic church where people all the time just served as a mouthpiece for God. Like, who gave you that authority? Like, did God speak to you and tell you that you all of a sudden you're the appointed messenger? Like, I don't understand that. And what's really interesting about all of that is the sole reason my parents were even bringing me to the front of the church in the first place, they weren't doing that to get words of prophecy. No, my parents were desperate. I had a heart condition. There was a hole in one of the valves of my heart that did not close. In normal, that's such a weird word, but in typical kids, they're born and that hole, it closes on its own very early in life. But for whatever reason, that didn't happen in my case. And so I'm a young kid being raised by parents who, are working class. Finances are tight, and even the out-of-pocket cost for surgery, even with insurance, was a lot. And so they were, out of desperation, bringing me to the front of this church to ask for a prayer of healing. And I, for as toxic and weird as my childhood was, I give my parents all the props in the world for doing that, because that was outside of the normal Christian understanding that they had grown up in. And in fact, they got a lot of flack from their parents for shifting gears a little bit and going to a more charismatic Pentecostal church. But they were desperate. They wanted God to magically heal this hole, and whether God would do that, is up for debate, but it's what they were wanting. Their intentions were good, but those intentions were co-opted. Now, I don't know what it was about me. If I just had the look of a pastor as a 7-year-old kid, I don't know. But these men would come over to me and lay hands on me and like jump back and say weird things like, this young man is going to be used mightily of God to reach young people. And like, what the fuck? Pardon my language, but seriously, how is that? How can you say that's God doing that? Like, the one thing that my parents wanted, you're denying them because you've got this hunch that this kid's going to do something great. Like, that is so messed up on so many levels. And I think that's another reason why it's so hard for me to trust people of faith. It's like they take what they're given and they co-opt it and twist it to fit their bizarre narrative that they're trying to write for somebody's life. It's so toxic.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, way to bring it full circle. Just with this idea of having to trust people in spite of traumatic events. That's something we have to do as humans, but I do find it somewhat admirable you're able to keep a lot of your orthodox beliefs in spite of some of the church culture toxicity you've experienced. I certainly am much more reluctant to even say things like God exists, even though I think I believe that, but I'm so reluctant to say it just because of the experiences I've had. And I think it's really admirable, and I'm sure it's taken a lot of work. I did want to kind of wind up too by saying, when we're talking about trust issues, I think it's really important to focus on the individual and not assume that everyone who doesn't trust churches anymore, doesn't trust Jesus anymore, whatever kind of language you want to use, to not assume anything about them, because it really could be any amount of things. I definitely want to have you back on, Ben, to talk more about kind of maybe more theological, technical issues. I think that might be kind of interesting, just based on, probably our shared education in the field, but probably different perspectives now. But this has been absolutely wonderful. talking about it. And can I just say, I don't know why I wasn't expecting this. You're just like this on your podcast with how vulnerable you are, but thank you for really stripping down, so to speak, and like laying yourself bare and like allowing me and listeners to just kind of look into your life in such a detailed way. It's that vulnerability is very valuable to me, and I'm sure to others as well.
One of the things that my therapist has said to me is there's a time and a place to be transparent, and there's a time and a place to not be so transparent. So I think I've kind of been learning this balance between laying it all out there when appropriate. And I think in this context, listeners of your podcast, I think it's a very safe space. So I would just want to say thank you for creating an environment where it's okay to be vulnerable. And I don't have trust issues of, your listeners somehow, I don't know, hearing this dirt that I've laid out and then using it against me. Like, that's the least of my concerns. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge and a risk to be open and vulnerable. But in my life experiences, whether on the podcast or in relationships with others, I've always found that being open and honest and vulnerable, it just sparks growth in other people. And the only reason that I'm this way is because there's been a line of people before me that have done similarly, and I've been able to see and learn and grow based on their example. So, I don't take myself too seriously, and I'm totally fine just putting it all out there, because hopefully it'll inspire others to do the same.
Well, it's greatly appreciated. Yeah, I do want to give you one last chance. I know we said it a few times, but go ahead and plug your podcast for the people.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you will likely enjoy all the others to be found at threadspodcast.com. Threads Podcast Life Unfiltered is a show all about living life honestly, talking openly about challenging subjects. We have 3 main focus areas that we cover on the show. All 3 of them were definitely present in today's episode here, but those 3 buckets that we seek to fill are mental health, faith, and uncomfortable conversations. So on each episode, you can expect to hear content that fits 1, 2, or even all 3 of those buckets. So again, it's Threads Podcast Life Unfiltered. We get our name Threads from the concept that in life, there are far more things that tie us together, threads, than there are things that separate us. So the name Threads is in honor of that fact that, there's a lot of collective experience that's woven into humanity that we could learn from by being vulnerable and by being willing to share our stories, and not just, the stuff we put on social media that we like to present ourselves as polished and put together. We want to be unfiltered, and that's where the whole Life Unfiltered part comes from. So check it out, threadspodcast.com.
Yeah, completely endorsed by John Werner. I'm a listener, and it truly is great. And I don't just say that flippantly because you're a guest. I truly do enjoy it. Thanks, Ben, for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, listener, and I'll talk to you all soon.
If you wish to learn more about what's going on in my life or wish to purchase my book, go to vulnerabooks.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, please continue to listen, follow, share, and consider supporting through the link in the show's notes. For as little as 99 cents a month, you can help me book guests, upgrade my production value, and start exciting projects. Thank you for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.